Back in 2020 and early 2021, Sony was entering a very different phase of gaming. The PlayStation 5 had just launched. Excitement for next generation hardware was at an all-time high, and publishers across the entire industry were aggressively chasing live service success. Every major company wanted the next massive online multiplayer phenomenon. Everybody wanted their own version of Fortnite, Rocket League, Apex Legends, or Destiny. The idea of releasing a game once and then generating revenue for years through battle passes, cosmetics, seasonal updates, and premium currencies had become the dream scenario for publishers. And in the middle of all that hype, PlayStation introduced one of the most interesting and ultimately one of the most forgotten exclusives of the PS5 launch era, Destruction AllStars. Now, years later, Sony has officially delisted Destruction AllStars and shut down its online servers, effectively ending the game's life cycle. And honestly, this isn't just a story of one multiplayer game failing to survive. This is a story about the dangers of chasing trends, the brutal reality of the live service market, and the growing issue of game preservation in an increasingly digital gaming industry. When Destruction All-Stars was first announced, there was genuine curiosity surrounding it. Developed by Lucid Games and published by Sony Interactive Entertainment, the game looked like a mix between vehicular combat, arcade sports entertainment, and hero shooter mechanics. Players would smash into each other in massive arenas using customizable vehicles while also controlling unique characters with their own abilities and special moves. The visual presentation was colorful and energetic, almost resembling a futuristic sports broadcast mixed with demolition derby chaos. It was loud, flashy, over the top, and clearly designed to appeal to streamers and competitive multiplayer players. At the time, Sony seemed incredibly confident in the project. In fact, a lot of people forget that Destruction All-Stars was originally intended to be a full-price PlayStation 5 launch title. Sony initially planned to sell the game at a premium price point alongside other major PS5 releases, but as launch approached, something changed. Whether it was internal feedback, concerns about player adoption, or worries about the game's longevity, Sony decided to delay the game and eventually release it through PlayStation Plus instead. Looking back, that decision may have revealed that Sony understood one major truth about the game before launch. Convincing people to spend full price on a multiplayer-only vehicular combat title in 2021 was going to be extremely difficult. Making the game available through PlayStation Plus gave Destruction All-Stars an enormous initial audience. Millions of PlayStation 5 owners suddenly had instant access to the game at no additional cost. From a visibility standpoint, this was probably the best possible scenario. Most multiplayer games would kill for that kind of built-in player base at launch. The problem was that getting players to try a game is very different from getting players to stay. And that's ultimately where Destruction All-Stars struggled the most. The first few hours of the game were genuinely entertaining for a lot of people. Smashing vehicles into each other at high speeds was chaotic fun. Jumping out of destroyed cars and sprinting across arenas while trying to hijack other players' vehicles created some intense moments. The arenas themselves looked impressive, especially early in the PS5 generation when players were eager to see what the new hardware could do. The game had personality. It had energy. But after the initial novelty wore off, many players started to realize there simply wasn't enough depth to sustain long-term engagement. That's the thing about live service games that publishers often underestimate. A game cannot survive purely on concept alone. The core gameplay loop has to remain rewarding for hundreds, sometimes thousands, of hours. Players need constant progression systems, meaningful unlocks, evolving content, seasonal updates, competitive incentives, and reasons to keep returning week after week. Modern multiplayer gaming is incredibly competitive because players are no longer choosing just what they want to play for one weekend. They're choosing what ecosystem they want to invest their time into long term. And time is the single most valuable resource in gaming. If somebody is already investing hours into Call of Duty, Fortnite, Rocket League, Grand Theft Auto Online, Rainbow Six Siege, Apex Legends, Overwatch 2, or Destiny 2, then convincing them to permanently add another multiplayer game into their rotation becomes incredibly difficult. Even if a new game is good, good often isn't enough anymore. A multiplayer game has to become essential. It has to create that feeling where players are afraid to miss out if they stop playing. Destruction All-Stars never fully achieved that. Part of the issue was repetition. While the gameplay was fun in short bursts, many players felt that matches began to feel similar fairly quickly. The character abilities weren't deep enough to fundamentally change how the game played, and the progression systems didn't feel rewarding enough to maintain long-term interest. There also wasn't enough content arriving consistently enough to keep momentum going. In the live service market, momentum is everything. Once player counts begin declining, matchmaking suffers. When matchmaking suffers, more players leave. Then updates slow down because the player base shrinks, and eventually, the entire ecosystem starts collapsing in on itself. What makes this even more fascinating is how perfectly Destruction AllStars represents a specific movement in the gaming industry. Around the late 2010s and early 2020s, nearly every publisher became obsessed with the idea of ongoing engagement. Single-player games were still successful, but executives saw the enormous recurring revenue generated by live service titles and wanted their own sustainable online platform. The industry became fixated on retention metrics, seasonal engagement, monetization pipelines, and player ecosystems. It wasn't enough anymore for a game to sell well once. Publishers wanted games that could continue generating money indefinitely. But there's a massive problem with that strategy. Not every game can survive forever. In fact, most of them can't. For every massively successful live service game, there are countless others that quietly disappear. Some fail immediately, others survive for a few years before shutting down, and some never even make it to release before being canceled entirely. Over the last several years, the gaming industry has become filled with stories about multiplayer projects struggling to find audiences. We've seen publishers spend enormous amounts of money developing live service games, only for those titles to collapse shortly after launch. Some projects get abandoned within months, others limp along before eventually shutting down servers completely. And now Destruction All-Stars joins that list. What's especially interesting is how this reflects on PlayStation itself. Historically, Sony built its reputation around major single-player exclusives. Games like God of War, The Last of Us, Ghost of Tsushima, Horizon, Spider-Man, and Uncharted helped define the PlayStation brand. These games focused on cinematic storytelling, polished gameplay, and memorable experiences. But during the PS5 era, Sony clearly wanted to expand further into multiplayer and live service territory. The company began investing more heavily into multiplayer projects and online-focused experiences. Some of those projects remain in development, while others have reportedly faced delays, restructuring, or cancellation. The failure of Destruction All-Stars likely became an important lesson internally for Sony. Launching a live service game is extraordinarily risky even for one of the biggest companies in gaming. You can have strong marketing, a recognizable platform, and millions of players trying the game initially, and still fail to maintain a sustainable audience. And honestly, timing probably hurt the game too. The PlayStation 5 launch period was one of the busiest and most chaotic console launches in recent memory. Players were dealing with hardware shortages, scalpers, supply chain issues, and an overwhelming number of major releases across the industry. In that environment, Destruction All-Stars struggled to stand out long term. It generated curiosity, but curiosity alone isn't enough to sustain a multiplayer ecosystem for years. Another important aspect of this story is the preservation problem surrounding online-only games. When servers shut down, entire experiences effectively vanish forever. That's something gaming continues to struggle with as the industry becomes increasingly dependent on online infrastructure. Older games often remain playable decades later because most of the content existed directly on the disc or cartridge. But modern live service games frequently depend on dedicated servers, online authentication, matchmaking systems, and constant back-end support. Once publishers decide maintaining those systems is no longer financially worthwhile, the game effectively ceases to exist in its intended form. That creates a frustrating reality for players. People can spend money on cosmetics, battle passes, upgrades, and digital content for years, only for the entire experience to eventually disappear. And while some games preserve offline functionality, multiplayer-focused titles often lose the vast majority of what made them unique once servers shut down. This is why more players have started becoming skeptical whenever publishers announce ambitious new live service projects. Gamers have seen too many titles launch with huge promises only to fade away a few years later. Trust becomes harder to maintain when consumers know there's a realistic possibility that a multiplayer game they invest time and money into may not even exist in the same form several years later. And yet, publishers continue chasing the model because when it works unbelievably well. The financial success of the biggest live service games is almost impossible for companies to ignore. A single massively successful multiplayer ecosystem can generate more recurring revenue than multiple traditional releases combined. That potential reward keeps publishers pursuing the dream despite the enormous risk. But Destruction All-Stars serves as another reminder that success in the market is incredibly rare. What's also unfortunate is that there really was potential here. The concept itself wasn't bad. A modern arcade vehicular combat game with PlayStation production values could absolutely work under the right circumstances. In another timeline, maybe with deeper progression systems, more modes, stronger long-term content support, and better player retention mechanics, things could have turned out differently. But in the real world, the game never reached the level of cultural relevance it needed to survive. And now its story comes to an end. The servers are offline, the game has been delisted, another live service title disappears into gaming history. But honestly, Destruction All-Stars may ultimately be remembered less for what it was and more for what it represented. A snapshot of an industry aggressively chasing live service success during a time when nearly every major publisher believed ongoing multiplayer ecosystems were the future of gaming. Now the industry feels different. There's still heavy investment in live service projects, but there's also far more caution. Publishers have realized how difficult it is to break into this market successfully. Players have become more selective about what games they commit to. And companies are learning that forcing live service mechanics into every project doesn't automatically create long-term success. At the end of the day, Destruction All-Stars wasn't a catastrophic disaster. It wasn't one of the worst games ever made. It wasn't completely broken or unplayable. Instead, it became something arguably more dangerous in today's gaming landscape: forgettable. And in the live service world, being forgettable can be fatal. But what do you think? Did you ever play Destruction All-Stars when it launched on PlayStation Plus? Did you enjoy it, or did you move on after a few matches? And do you think Sony could continue pushing deeper into live service gaming, or focus more heavily on the single-player exclusives that helped define the PlayStation brand in the first place? If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. Also, check out my Patreon for exclusive content. My latest Patreon exclusive is called Why Survival Games Keep Captivating Players, where I take a deep dive into why the survival genre continues dominating the gaming industry and why players keep coming back to those experiences year after year. Thank you all so much for watching. Game on!